The aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air as Jake wiped down the worn Formica counter. His calloused hands bore the marks of years of honest work. As he glanced up, a well-dressed stranger entered the diner. Jake's eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition passing across his face. He approached the man, his heart pounding. "I'm sorry, but I can't serve you," Jake said, his voice steady. The diner fell silent. All eyes turned to the unfolding scene. In that moment, neither Jake nor the customer could have predicted how this encounter would challenge their beliefs and change their lives forever. The sun-bleached sign of Rosie's Diner creaked in the warm breeze, a stark contrast to the stillness inside. Jake, the waiter, moved between tables with practiced efficiency, his footsteps barely audible on the worn linoleum floor. As Jake refilled coffee cups, his mind wandered to the headlines he'd scrolled through that morning: tech moguls and their grand schemes, promises of a better future that seemed to leave so many behind. The diner was his domain, a small corner of the world where he could make a difference. The bell above the door chimed. Jake looked up, his hand pausing mid-wipe as a figure stepped inside. The man who entered was unassuming, yet oddly familiar. Jake's eyes narrowed as recognition dawned, his hand tightening on the worn notepad in his apron pocket. As Jake drew closer, memories flooded back. Headlines splashed across his phone screen, tweets that had fueled his growing resentment. This man represented everything Jake had come to despise about the tech industry's unchecked power. Jake's principles warred with his ingrained hospitality as he stopped before the table. The man looked up, smiling, waiting to be greeted. But the words caught in Jake's throat, replaced by a heavy silence. The other patrons sensed the shift, their conversations dying down. "I'm sorry, but I can't serve you," Jake said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The diner fell silent, all eyes fixed on the scene. The man blinked in surprise. "I know who you are, Mr. Musk," Jake continued, his voice low but firm, "and I can't in good conscience provide service to someone whose actions and words have caused so much harm." Elon Musk leaned back, his expression unreadable. The other patrons whispered among themselves, craning their necks for a better view. Jake stood his ground, even as doubt began to creep in. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. Then, to everyone's surprise, Musk smiled. It wasn't cocky, but almost wistful. "I understand," Musk said quietly. "You're not the first person to refuse me service. Mind if I share a story?" Jake hesitated, caught off guard. He glanced around at the curious faces of the other patrons. Against his better judgment, he nodded. As Musk began to speak, his voice low and measured, the atmosphere shifted. The initial tension dissipated, replaced by curiosity. Jake found himself listening intently, his earlier certainty wavering in the face of Musk's candid words. The quiet hum of anticipation in the diner grew as Musk's story unfolded. What could this titan of industry possibly say to change Jake's mind? The answer would challenge everything Jake thought he knew about the man before him. Elon Musk's presence created a palpable tension. Some patrons leaned forward, straining to catch every word, while others averted their gaze. Jake stood his ground, even as doubt began to creep in. He'd always prided himself on his principles, but now, faced with the man himself, Jake felt a flicker of uncertainty. Musk leaned back, his eyes scanning the room. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft clink of cutlery and the hum of the old refrigerator. Jake's coworker, Sarah, shot him a worried glance. "I understand," Musk said softly. "May I ask why?" Jake blinked, thrown off balance by the calm inquiry. "I don't agree with your actions," he managed. "The way you run your companies, the things you say on social media, I believe they've caused harm." Musk nodded slowly. "That's fair. I've made mistakes. But may I share something with you?" Jake hesitated, then nodded. "When I was starting out, I faced a lot of rejection," Musk began. "People told me my ideas were impossible, that I was foolish to even try. But I believed in what I was doing, just as you believe in your principles now." Jake found himself leaning in, despite his initial resistance. "I remember one investor who not only rejected my pitch but laughed me out of his office," Musk continued. "He said electric cars were a pipe dream, that no one would ever want them. But I didn't let that stop me. I kept pushing, kept working because I believed it was important. The diner was utterly silent now, every person hanging on Musk's words. Jake felt a strange mix of emotions churning inside him, skepticism warring with a grudging respect for the perseverance Musk described. "I'm not saying this to change your mind about serving me," Musk said, meeting Jake's eyes. "Your principles are your own, and I respect that. But I hope you'll consider that sometimes the most important work comes from challenging the status quo, even when it's unpopular." Jake stood there, frozen in place, as Musk's words sank in. He'd never considered the billionaire in this light before, as someone who had faced rejection and doubt. It didn't erase Jake's concerns, but it added a new dimension to his understanding. "Thank you for sharing that," Jake said finally. "I need some time to think." Musk nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Take all the time you need, and regardless of your decision, I respect your conviction. It's not easy to stand up for what you believe in, especially when faced with opposition." As Jake turned and walked toward the kitchen, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. The world he was beginning to realize was far more complex than he had imagined. Jake turned back to face Musk, his voice low but steady as he began to speak. He laid out his concerns about the impact of Musk companies on the world, touching on the environmental cost of battery production, the potential dangers of AI development, and the way Musk's public statements sometimes seem to disregard consequences. As Jake spoke, his words grew more impassioned. He described his small hometown, changed by the closure of a factory that couldn't compete with automation. He spoke of friends who'd lost jobs, of families struggling. "It's about real people, real lives," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. Musk listened intently, his expression thoughtful. As Jake finished, a hush fell over the diner. Musk leaned forward, his eyes holding a glimmer of something Jake couldn't quite identify. "Your concerns are valid," Musk began quietly. "I've heard similar worries before. Let me share a story about rejection and perseverance." He spoke of his early days as an entrepreneur, of nights spent sleeping on office floors, subsisting on hot dogs and oranges. "There was one investor," Musk said with a rueful smile, "who laughed me out of his office when I pitched electric cars, told me I'd be better off selling used cars in New Jersey." Jake found himself leaning in, drawn in despite his initial skepticism. "But every rejection wasn't just about me," Musk continued. "It was about the vision for a better future, a future with sustainable energy, with technology that could solve our biggest problems." Jake nodded, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "But at what cost?" he asked. "How do we balance progress with the immediate needs of people who are struggling now?" Musk considered this. "It's like planting a forest," he said. "You have to start with saplings that seem fragile and insignificant. It takes time and care, and sometimes it looks like nothing's happening. But eventually you have a thriving ecosystem that benefits everyone." The atmosphere in the diner had shifted. The earlier tension had given way to a sense of shared experience, of unexpected connection. Jake found himself nodding, seeing Musk not just as a billionaire, but as someone who had faced his own struggles and setbacks. "I'm not asking you to agree with everything I do or say," Musk said, his expression open and earnest. "But I hope you can see that behind the headlines and controversies, there's a genuine attempt to push humanity forward. Sometimes we stumble, sometimes we make mistakes, but we keep trying, because the alternative is to give up on the possibility of a better future." The tension in the diner softened, replaced by curiosity. Musk's story unfolded like a tapestry, weaving together threads of failure, persistence, and unexpected kindness. His voice, usually associated with grand announcements, now carried a different timbre, one of vulnerability and shared experience. "You know, there was this time," Musk began, his eyes distant with memory, "when I was trying to launch my first startup. I had this idea for revolutionizing online city guides. It sounds quaint now, but back then, it was cutting edge." The patrons leaned in, their meals forgotten. Jake found himself drawn into the narrative, his earlier defensiveness giving way to grudging interest. He noticed the lines around Musk's eyes, the way his hands moved as he spoke, gestures that humanized the billionaire. Musk continued, describing his pitch to a Wall Street investor who dismissed the internet as a fad. Jake's eyebrows shot up, his stance softening. He'd heard stories of Musk's wealth and controversial tweets, but this was something he could relate to. As Musk spoke of rejection and perseverance, the atmosphere transformed. Jake found himself nodding along, recognizing echoes of his own struggles. He caught himself studying Musk's expression, searching for signs of insincerity, but finding only genuine emotion. There were nights, Musk said, his voice lowering, when I questioned everything. Was I delusional? Should I give up and get a real job? But then I'd remember why I started in the first place, the vision of a future where technology could solve our biggest problems. The other patrons were rapt, their own experiences reflected in Musk's words. Jake's earlier anger had melted away, replaced by grudging respect. He'd judged Musk based on headlines, but here was a man sharing stories of failure and resilience that could have been his own. Jake leaned forward, drawn in by Musk's candor. He noticed the way Musk's hands trembled slightly as he recounted near bankruptcies and moments of doubt. "But you know what kept me going?" Musk asked, looking around the diner. "It was the people who believed in the vision, even when I doubted it myself. The engineers who worked crazy hours, the customers who took a chance on our first clunky products, even the critics who pushed us to do better." As Musk's story neared its end, Jake felt a shift within himself. The gap between billionaire and small-town residents seemed to narrow, bridged by common threads of struggle and hope. "Sometimes," Musk concluded softly, "the greatest growth comes from our most difficult moments. It's easy to give up when things get tough, but that's exactly when we need to dig deep and remember why we started in the first place." A murmur of agreement rippled through the diner. Jake's perspective had shifted, his initial hostility giving way to a complex mix of emotions: respect, curiosity, and a newfound willingness to listen. The diner hung in a moment of suspended animation, the air thick with possibility. Jake stood at the crossroads, his principles clashing with his newfound empathy. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, each second stretching into eternity. The clink of silverware against plates seemed amplified, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead a constant low-pitched drone. Jake's mind flashed back to a similar moment years ago, when he'd stood outside his father's hospital room, torn between anger and forgiveness. He'd chosen anger then, and the regret still gnawed at him. Now, faced with another pivotal choice, he felt the weight of that past decision. Sarah approached quietly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her touch grounded him, reminding him of their conversations about fairness and second chances. Jake's gaze flickered to her face, finding understanding in her eyes. Across the diner, Musk waited, his posture open and non-threatening. Jake found himself seeing not just the controversial public figure, but a man who had faced his own battles and setbacks. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each click reverberating through the diner. Jake's mind raced, weighing his initial stance against the unexpected connection he now felt. He thought of his community, of the friends and neighbors who had struggled in the wake of economic changes. The anger he'd felt before now felt hollow in the face of shared humanity. With a slight tremor in his hand, Jake reached for his notepad. He met Musk's gaze, seeing not a billionaire or a controversial figure, but simply another human being seeking connection. "What can I get you?" Jake asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. A ripple of release moved through the diner. Musk's face lit up with a genuine smile, tinged with respect. "Thank you," he said simply. "I'd love a cup of coffee if you have it." As Jake scribbled down the order, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. His hand steadied, and he took a deep breath, feeling as if he could finally exhale fully for the first time in hours. Musk's shoulders visibly relaxed, the tension in his jaw easing. Jake moved behind the counter, pouring steaming coffee into a mug. The familiar motions felt different now, imbued with new meaning. As he placed the cup in front of Musk, their eyes met again. In that moment of connection, Jake realized that this simple act was more than just serving coffee. It was a small step toward bridging divides in a fractured world. The air in the diner crackled with renewed anticipation. The earlier tension had dissipated, replaced by curiosity and respect. Musk had finished his meal, engaging in light conversation with other patrons. Jake watched from behind the counter, his earlier hostility now a complex blend of emotions. As he saw Musk glance towards him, Jake knew the encounter was drawing to a close. With a deep breath, Jake approached the table, check in hand. His footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet diner. Other customers pretended to be engrossed in their meals, but their attention was palpable. Musk looked up as Jake placed the check on the table. Their eyes met, and Jake felt a flicker of uncertainty. What would happen now? Reaching for his wallet, Musk's movements were unhurried and deliberate. Jake found himself holding his breath, aware that everyone else in the diner was doing the same. The air grew thick with expectation. Musk paused, his hand halfway to his pocket. He seemed to be considering something, his gaze distant for a moment before focusing back on Jake. The silence stretched, elastic and fragile. Then with a slight nod, Musk pulled out his wallet. But instead of simply producing a credit card or cash, he reached into an inner pocket and withdrew an envelope. It was plain and white, yet it seemed to carry an immense weight of meaning. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. What was in that envelope? A lawsuit? A job offer? His mind raced with possibilities. Musk held out the envelope along with a crisp $100 bill. "Thank you for your honesty," he said simply, his voice low but clear in the hushed diner. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he reached out to accept both. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in his grasp, as if it contained more than just paper. In that moment, Jake understood that whatever was inside would change things. As Jake stood there, the atmosphere in the diner shifted once more. It was as if everyone collectively exhaled, releasing a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The spell of silence broke, replaced by a low murmur of speculation. Musk stood, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape against the linoleum floor. He nodded once more to Jake, their eyes locking in a moment of unspoken understanding. Then he turned to address the diner at large. "Thank you all for your hospitality," he said. "It's been enlightening." With that, he made his way to the door. The bell chimed as he stepped out into the afternoon sun, leaving behind a diner full of stunned faces and one very conflicted waiter. Jake looked down at the envelope in his hand. Should he open it now in front of everyone? Or wait until he was alone? The curiosity was almost painful, but something held him back. This moment, whatever it was, felt too personal to share. The diner hummed with newfound energy, conversations flowing through worn booths and along the counter. Jake stood behind the polished surface, his fingers brushing against the unopened envelope in his pocket. As he poured coffee for regulars, sideways glances and hushed whispers filled the air. Old Man Johnson leaned close to Mrs. Peterson, sharing wild theories about the envelope's contents. Jake caught snippets. SpaceX, donation, job offer, each guess more outlandish than the last. Sarah, his co-worker, sidled up, her eyes bright with excitement. "Can you believe what happened today?" she whispered. As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself engaged in conversations he never thought he'd have. Regular customers who'd barely spoken more than their usual orders now lingered, sharing stories of unexpected encounters and life-changing moments. Mr. Grayson, a retired teacher, placed a wrinkled hand on Jake's arm. "You know, son," he said, voice gravelly with age, "it takes courage to stand up for what you believe in, but it takes even more to listen and reconsider. You did both today." Jake felt warmth spread through his chest at the old man's words. He'd spent so long seeing the world in black and white, but today had blurred those lines. A small crowd gathered outside, curious onlookers peering through windows. Sarah approached with a local newspaper reporter. "Jake," she said hesitantly, "would you mind answering a few questions?" Jake felt nervousness flutter in his stomach. He'd never sought the spotlight, but as he looked around at familiar faces, he realized this moment wasn't just about him. It was about their community, about the possibility of change. With a deep breath, Jake nodded. As he recounted the day's events, he found himself grappling with the implications. He'd stood up for his beliefs, but also opened himself to a new perspective. Throughout his shift, Jake's fingers kept brushing against the envelope. Several times he nearly tore it open, curiosity gnawing at him, but each time a customer's question or a task pulled him away. Finally, as the last patron left and Sarah flipped the close sign, Jake found himself alone. The envelope seemed to burn in his pocket. With trembling fingers, he pulled it out and carefully broke the seal. Inside was a generous tip and a handwritten note from Musk. The words spoke of admiration for Jake's principles and willingness to engage in difficult conversations. But it was the last line that made Jake's breath catch. Your courage and openness have inspired me. I'd like to offer a grant to help revitalize your town's economy and create new job opportunities. Let's work together to make a positive change. The encounter at Rosie's Diner became a catalyst for change in the small town. Jake's journey from skepticism to understanding sparked conversations about prejudice and second chances. Months later, the diner had become a symbol of unity, drawing diverse patrons. Jake now saw each customer as a story waiting to unfold, a perspective that might broaden his own. Serving coffee had become an opportunity for profound connection. As Jake reflected on his transformation, he wondered how many other unexpected connections were waiting to be made if only we opened our hearts to understanding.